8 weeks away on a work assignment. The day I came home, she smiled and said, "Congratulations, I'm 5 weeks pregnant." I froze. Could time itself bend the truth? I asked for a DNA test. She refused. From that moment, I knew my life had stepped into a cycle. Not for 1 year, not 5, but for 15 years. Every 2 years, I've had to stand in court, renewing a restraining order. And every time it expires, she comes back, always with that little girl. A girl raised to believe I was her father. She calls my son her little brother. And this time, she walked right into his school, stood before him, and smiled. "I'm your big sister." I don't hate a child, but I have to protect my family. I've lived too long on the thin edge between dignity, the law, and the truth. This is my story. And if you've ever had to fight for justice, for your own name, you'll understand. Stay with me. We'll walk this journey to the very end. Before that work trip, I had already made up my mind. Our relationship had been crumbling for months. Alyssa's jealousy, her constant demands, the way she wanted to control my every move. It had drained me. I was done. So when I stepped through the door after 8 weeks away, my plan was simple. End it with honesty, walk away clean. Her sudden good news didn't change that. I didn't shout, I didn't accuse. I laid it out as clear as I could. If a DNA test proves this child is mine, I will take responsibility. I'll provide financial support. I'll share custody. We'll do it properly, with lawyers, with the court, with respect for the child. That was my line. Firm, but fair. But Alyssa wanted none of it. She refused the test outright, like I had insulted her. And then she went further, telling our friends, our families, anyone who would listen, that I was a coward, that I had gotten her pregnant and abandoned her. Overnight, I became the villain in a story I had no control over. It was the beginning of a war I never wanted, a war built not on truth but on whispers. And whispers can destroy a man's name faster than any verdict in court. It didn't take long for the pressure to start. My circle of friends, people who had known me for years, suddenly looked at me differently. "Be a good man," they said. "Let her stay with you. Help her until the baby comes. It's the decent thing to do." Their words cut deeper than they realized. They weren't standing in my shoes. They weren't carrying the weight of suspicion that followed me everywhere I went. I wasn't reckless. I called a lawyer. I wanted to know where the line really was. And he didn't hesitate. If you let her move in, if you give her public support, if you act like you're taking responsibility, then the court can see that as paternity. It could bind you to a child that isn't yours. Once that line is crossed, it's hard to ever step back. His warning hit me like a hammer. So when the suggestion came again, "Just let her stay for a while, Dan, it's the right thing to do," I blocked it, flat out. And in return, I got those judgmental stares, as if I had failed some unspoken test of manhood. They didn't see me as careful, they saw me as cold. And that judgment would follow me just as long as Alyssa's lies. I tried to explain myself the best I could. "I'm not shirking responsibility," I told them. "I'm asking for the truth. That's all. If the child is mine, I'll step up without hesitation. But I won't carry the weight of a lie just to look noble in your eyes." Still, my words landed flat. They wanted a gesture, not a principle. One friend in particular wouldn't let it go. He leaned on me again. "Dan, charity isn't a legal stick. Helping her out won't trap you. You're overthinking this." His confidence irritated me, so I turned the argument back on him. "If you believe that, then let her stay at your place. You can be the good man. You can open your doors." There was silence after that. He never brought it up again. And then came the inevitable. Alyssa gave birth. The text messages arrived with the first photos. Tiny hands, scrunched up face, captions like, "Your daughter misses you. She wants to know where daddy is." I stared at the pictures, but they didn't answer the question that mattered most. They only deepened the fog of doubt, and the battle for truth was only beginning. The first message came not long after the birth. "Maya asks where daddy is." My phone lit up with those words, followed by another picture of a newborn wrapped in a pink blanket. I stared at the photo for a long time. The truth was, all babies look the same to me, tiny, fragile, red-faced, their features still unformed. I couldn't tell anything from that image, no matter how many times I zoomed in. It wasn't evidence. It was just a photograph attached to a claim I had never agreed to. I replied the only way I knew how, the same two conditions, word for word. Alyssa, I will sit down with a lawyer. We'll handle custody and financial support, but only after a DNA test confirms the truth. She ignored it. Again. She called the request insulting. She said a real man wouldn't need proof. She didn't want the truth. She wanted my compliance. And so the cycle began. Messages at odd hours, photos I never asked for, unannounced appearances at my door. Until finally, I was forced into a corner. I went to court and filed for a restraining order. It wasn't what I wanted, but it was the only way left to breathe. When the judge signed that first restraining order, I thought maybe, just maybe, it would give me real peace. But in my state, something called a permanent RO is a misnomer. Without proof of violence, it isn't permanent at all. It lasts barely 2 years and then it dissolves as if nothing ever happened. 2 years sounds like a long stretch on paper. In reality, it vanishes in a blink. The day the first order expired, I didn't even make it a week before Alyssa showed up again. Same pattern, same demands, same refusal to acknowledge the one thing that could end it all, a simple DNA test. I had to go back, file again, explain again, and sit through the same questions from the court. The second order was granted, and then the third, and then the fourth. It became a loop, a clock that reset every 24 months. And every time it did, I found myself dragged back into the same fight, as if the last years of my life hadn't happened. The cycle ate into my time, my energy, my marriage, and my peace of mind. It was no longer just a legal process. It was a shadow hanging over every part of my life. As each restraining order crept toward its expiration date, the tension built like a drumbeat in my chest. Weeks before the deadline, I'd lie awake at night, staring at the ceiling, waiting for the inevitable. Every creak in the house sounded like footsteps. Every gust of wind against the window felt like a knock at the door. Sometimes I'd glance outside and see nothing more than the shape of a tree in the yard, but in my exhausted mind it looked like a shadow standing there, waiting. And when the order lapsed, it was always the same. Alyssa would reappear as if summoned by a clock only she could hear. She'd bring photos, stories, accusations. I'd repeat my conditions over and over like a broken record. 1. A DNA test. 2. Once paternity is legally established, I'll take responsibility, financially, emotionally, all of it. But she never agreed. Refusal after refusal. The cycle fed on itself, and I had no way to break it. Then, in the middle of that endless loop, something shifted. I met Lauren. She was calm where my world was chaos. She listened without judgment. For the first time in years, I felt a glimmer of light breaking through the tunnel, and I held on to it. When I met Lauren, I promised myself one thing. I wouldn't hide. No secrets, no half-truths. On one of our first serious conversations, I laid it all out. Alyssa, the supposed pregnancy, the restraining orders, the cycle that never seemed to end. I braced myself for the look I'd seen before, the judgment that said, "You're the problem, Dan." But Lauren didn't flinch. She didn't run. She listened quietly, and when I finished, she asked me a single question. "What do you need to be at peace?" No one had asked me that before. Not what Alyssa wanted, not what the court demanded, not what friends thought was decent, but what I needed. That question told me who she was, and that's when I knew she was different. We built our life carefully, intentionally. We set boundaries, not just with Alyssa, but with everyone. What was ours stayed ours. What mattered most was protected. That foundation became our home. And when Ethan was born, everything sharpened into focus. Holding my son, I realized children don't just deserve love, they deserve absolute safety, and I was determined to give him that, no matter the cost. Even after I had settled into a new life with Lauren, the cycle didn't stop. Alyssa always found her way back, so I sent her a message I thought was unshakable. 1. A DNA test. 2. If the child is mine, I will accept full responsibility. Support, custody, everything, done legally and properly. That was it. 2 simple conditions. A path to the truth that any reasonable person would accept. But Alyssa didn't. She replied the same way she always had. "That's offensive. I don't need to prove anything." And yet she kept showing up, at the edge of our driveway, outside events, sometimes slipping letters into the mailbox as though repetition could bend reality. The words never changed, only the locations. That's when I realized good faith wasn't enough. If I wanted peace, I had to build a wall of evidence. I started documenting everything: text messages, voicemails, photos of her unexpected appearances, dates and times written down in a logbook. Not for me, but for the court. Because when words are twisted and reputations are dragged through the mud, cold, written proof is the only defense that still holds weight. There were stretches when the silence almost felt normal. Weeks would turn into months without a message, without a knock on the door, without a glimpse of her car idling at the end of the street. In those rare moments, I'd catch myself wondering if the storm had finally passed. Maybe Alyssa had moved on. Maybe Maya was being allowed to grow up without being fed this story that chained me to them. I almost believed it. Almost. But then it always came back. It never took more than a single ping on my phone, one unexpected DM, or a shadow spotted across the yard to shatter the illusion. The storm was never gone. It was just waiting for its next chance. And every return carried a little more weight, like the years themselves had sharpened the edges. Because now, Maya wasn't a baby anymore. She was growing up, old enough to talk, old enough to recognize faces, old enough to learn names. And somehow, she learned Ethan's name, my son, my boy, my responsibility to protect. That's when the storm stopped being mine alone. It was reaching into my child's life, and that changed everything. The moment I had been dreading came on what should have been an ordinary school day. Ethan was 9, old enough to be excited about a field trip, still young enough to wave at me with pride when I volunteered as one of the parent supporters. The buses pulled into the Columbus Zoo, the kids tumbling out in groups, chattering with the kind of joy only children can muster. I was just happy to be there, to share a safe, normal day with my son. But safety shattered in seconds. Out of the corner of my eye, I noticed a girl standing apart from the group. She didn't wear a school badge, didn't hold a zoo ticket. She just stood there, watching. And then she walked straight toward Ethan. Calm, certain, like she knew exactly who she was looking for. She leaned down and said the words that froze my blood. "I am your sister. My name is Maya." Ethan's eyes widened, but he remembered the talks we had at home, the lessons about stranger danger. Without hesitation, he turned and bolted toward his teacher. My heart broke, and yet swelled with pride. My son had listened. He knew how to protect himself. And in that moment, I realized how crucial those lessons had been. For a moment, I stood frozen in place. My body was caught between two instincts, pulling me in opposite directions. One part of my heart surged forward, ready to protect my son from any threat, ready to scoop him into my arms and shield him from the world. The other part ached, for a little girl who had been fed a story her whole life, a child who believed she was approaching her brother with nothing but innocence. The clash of those feelings was almost unbearable, but instinct won. I kept my composure, walked to the teacher, and reported exactly what had happened. I spoke to the head chaperone, then the organizing committee, making sure every detail was recorded. I wrote it all down for myself as well, the time, the place, the words exchanged. Years of repetition had taught me that if I didn't document everything, the story could be twisted. Evidence was my only shield. That night, the hardest part wasn't the paperwork. It was the meeting with other parents. I had to stand in front of them and explain why a strange girl had walked up to my son claiming to be his sister. And I had to say the words no father ever wants to say, "She is not my daughter." In the heat of that tense conversation, my nerves got the better of me. Surrounded by concerned faces, questions flying at me from every direction, I tried to lighten the unbearable weight pressing down on my chest. And without thinking, I blurted it out. I called Maya a nodder. Not daughter, nodder. A girl who wasn't my child. It slipped from my lips like a defense mechanism, half joke, half shield. And the second I said it, I regretted it. The room fell uncomfortably quiet. One of the parents spoke up, her voice sharp, cutting through the silence. "That's cruel. She's just a child. Whatever's happening between you and her mother, mocking her like that is wrong." Her words stung, her words. Not because she misunderstood, but because there was truth in them. I wasn't mocking Maya. I wasn't trying to hurt her. But in that moment, I realized what I was doing, clinging to humor, as a way to survive a situation that had already drained me for 15 years. That mother was right about one thing. My words weren't fair to the child. They were the words of a man drowning, grasping for air in the only way he knew how. Humor has always been my thin shield. When the pressure builds so high it feels like my chest will crack, I make a joke. I twist the pain into something lighter, something I can carry without collapsing under its weight. If I don't joke, I'll break. And for years that small layer of humor has kept me standing in a storm that never ends. But the truth is, shields can cut both ways. The words that protect me can wound someone else, and in this case, that someone is an innocent child. Maya didn't choose this. She didn't choose the lies. She didn't choose to approach Ethan at the zoo with a script written by her mother. She just followed what she was told was true. My shield, my sarcasm, landed on her shoulders. And that isn't fair. I can't survive on jokes forever. They don't resolve anything. They don't prove anything. They don't stop the cycle. They just buy me another breath. What I need isn't wit or clever remarks. What I need is proof. Cold, undeniable proof. DNA, black and white. Because only the truth can cut through the fog of accusations and free us all. The cruelest irony is that in my state, the power to establish paternity doesn't start with me. It starts with the mother. The law is clear. She is the one who must file the petition to name a father. Without that step, I am legally a stranger to the child. I can't walk into the courthouse, hand them a swab of my DNA, and demand an answer. That door is locked from the inside, and Alyssa holds the key. There is, however, a tiny exception, a narrow 31-day window right after a child is born. In that short stretch, a man who believes he might be the father can voluntarily submit his DNA to the state registry. If he does, the court can tie his name to the child. 31 days. That's it. By the time I learned this, the window had long slammed shut. I was too focused on survival, on filing restraining orders, on keeping Alyssa away from my door. I missed it. And the law is written that way for a reason. It's designed to protect victims, women who've fled abusive partners, women who need to rebuild lives without being hunted down. I respect that. But the system doesn't distinguish between an abuser and a man simply asking for the truth. In its eyes, we're both the same, and that's the hardest part to swallow. One of my attorneys explained it in plain, almost brutal terms. Dan, imagine a woman escapes an abusive partner. She's pregnant but never lists him on the birth certificate. She never asks for child support, never files a claim. In the eyes of the law, she's protecting herself and the child. That man can't suddenly show up years later, demand a DNA test, and use the child as a chain to pull her back. The system won't allow it. I understood the logic. I even respected the intent. But in my case, the rule became a trap. Because Alyssa never filed anything, never initiated paternity, the court considered me what the law calls a legal stranger. No record, no standing. I wasn't the father on paper, which meant I had no right to ask for confirmation one way or the other. That realization hit hard. I couldn't march into court and demand clarity. I couldn't file for custody to force a DNA test. My hands were tied by the very laws meant to protect families. All I could do was stand outside the gates of the system, repeating the same two conditions, while the truth dangled just out of reach. Over the years, I've cycled through lawyer after lawyer, hoping that someone, somewhere, would finally give me a different answer. I wanted to believe there was a loophole I had missed, some hidden clause buried deep in the statutes that could break the cycle once and for all. But every consultation ended the same way. The attorneys flipped through their books, looked me in the eye, and repeated what I already knew but hated to hear. There's no legal path forward, not without her initiating. All you can do is keep renewing restraining orders, keep waiting, and keep documenting. No shortcuts, no miracle motions, just the grind of court dates every 2 years, stacks of paperwork, and the gnawing weight of time. It was maddening, like being locked in a cell where the walls reset themselves every 24 months. But this time was different. At the zoo, when Maya approached Ethan, there hadn't just been me or my son to bear witness. There had been teachers, staff, parents, and one of those teachers filed a report. For the first time in 15 years, I wasn't standing alone with my word against Alyssa's. There was someone else who could testify to what really happened, and that changed everything. After the zoo incident, I treated it the same way I had treated every other encounter, with precision and documentation. I sat down at the kitchen table that night and wrote a full report of what had happened. The time the field trip began, the route the class had taken through the Columbus Zoo, the exact spot where Maya had approached Ethan. I attached the emails I had exchanged with the school afterward, along with the photos taken by other parents that showed her presence on zoo grounds. Every detail mattered, because I'd learned long ago that the smallest inconsistency could be used against me. When I handed the packet to my lawyer, he flipped through it slowly, nodding as he read. Then he leaned back and said something I hadn't heard before. CPS will be interested in this. Those words landed differently. For years, every door I tried to open had slammed shut, but now he was pointing to one that might actually swing inward. For the first time in a long time, I felt like something new had entered the picture. Not just another restraining order, not just waiting. A new door had just opened, and it might lead to the truth. It didn't take long before Child Protective Services reached out. They had opened a file. The caseworker's voice was steady, professional, but the questions cut deep. She wanted to know not just what happened at the zoo, but whether this was part of a pattern. How often has this occurred? How many times has your son been exposed to contact from Alyssa or Maya? What impact do you believe it's had on him? I was ready. I laid out the thick folder I had kept for years, the restraining orders stacked like clockwork, each one dated 2 years apart. The log of Alyssa's reappearances, driveway confrontations, uninvited visits, messages slipped under doors. I explained how Ethan had grown up with the constant warning of stranger danger, not because of nameless threats, but because of one child being used to reach him. I told them about the nightmares, the questions he had asked me late at night when he didn't fully understand what was happening. When I later sat down with my attorney, he nodded grimly. "This is where a guardian ad litem might come into play," he said. A court-appointed guardian for Maya, someone neutral, who could request a DNA test on her behalf. For the first time, the decision might not rest in Alyssa's hands alone. My lawyer explained it carefully, making sure I understood what a guardian ad litem really was. A gal isn't a foster parent, Dan. They're not there to raise the child or take anyone's side. Their only role is to represent the best interests of the child in court. They speak for the child when the parents can't or won't. The words hit me like a spark in the dark. Because if a gal were assigned to Maya, the focus would no longer be on Alyssa's refusal or my endless petitions. The court-appointed guardian could look at the situation objectively, ask whether living in this endless cycle of harassment was truly in Maya's best interest, and, most importantly, request a DNA test. Not for me, not for Alyssa, but for Maya herself. And that possibility changed everything. For the first time in 15 years, the truth wasn't just a dangling hope. It was a path, a real, legal path that didn't rely on Alyssa's permission or my desperate bargaining. I sat there staring at my lawyer, feeling something I hadn't felt in so long I almost didn't recognize it. Relief. For the first time in 15 years, I saw a way out. Work forced me on the road for weeks, sometimes months. At first I missed home, but slowly I realized what I missed wasn't Alyssa. It was peace. With her, there had been no peace. Jealousy followed me like a shadow. She demanded proof of where I'd been, every receipt, every call. What she called love was really control, and the walls closed tighter every day. One night in a hotel, I stared at the ceiling and understood. I wasn't choosing freedom. I was choosing survival. The truth was, our story had ended long before the news of pregnancy. Alyssa wanted to lock me into a life where suspicion was the foundation. I chose to walk away, not from responsibility, but from a prison disguised as marriage. I repeated the same words over and over in my head. If it's my child, I will be a father, a proper father. I had plans written down, child support calculations, time-sharing schedules, even an education fund I'd started just in case. Every angle, every responsibility, I was prepared. But Alyssa didn't want support or co-parenting or structure. She wanted unconditional marriage, as if a piece of paper could force love. She wanted me back, not for who I was, but for the control I once represented. The more I offered clarity, the more she demanded chains. I had heard it too many times. A real father doesn't need proof. But proof isn't the enemy. proof is freedom. DNA doesn't insult anyone, it releases the truth. So I drew my own boundary. No test, no contact. That was the only way to stay sane. Some nights Ethan would ask why we couldn't just help the lady with the baby. I held him close and whispered, because real help doesn't come from lies. One day you'll understand. It wasn't cruelty, it was survival. When the mutual friend disappeared, I understood why. Everyone chose the story they wanted to believe. Some whispered that I abandoned a child. Others believed Alyssa's silence. I stopped justifying myself. Instead, I saved everything. Texts, photos, receipts. Not to convince the world, but to leave a trail of truth. In the meantime, I poured myself into Ethan. Saturday mornings at the park, teaching him how to ride a bike. Evenings with math homework sprawled across the table. Each small act reminded me I wasn't just defending myself. I was practicing to be a calm, steady father, no matter what storm surrounded us. I taught Ethan early. Not everyone who says Dad said is telling the truth. If it doesn't feel safe, you come back to me. We practiced a safety script. What to say to strangers, when to run to a teacher, how to find help. He memorized it like lines in a play. And one day, that script wasn't just practice. It saved him at the zoo. Because love isn't only hugs and bedtime stories. Love is preparing your child for the dangers you pray they'll never meet. Lauren isn't just my wife. She's my teammate in every sense of the word. Calm, straightforward, unflinching in the face of truth. While I organize evidence with the lawyer, she keeps detailed notes. Every phone call, every appearance, marked with time and place. We've learned to play roles. I face the court, she builds the record. One night, Ethan came home from school with a drawing labeled My Family. Just 3 figures, me, Lauren, and himself. No extras, no confusion. He handed it to me and said, "This is who I know." My throat tightened. That picture said more than any binder of evidence ever could. Lauren looked at it, then at me, and whispered, "We fight this together, but we don't fight dirty." Her words hit me like steel. She wasn't just supporting me, she was standing shoulder to shoulder. The new restraining order hearing was scheduled, a date on the calendar. Another battle ahead, but this time, not alone. Each restraining order cost time, money, and left invisible scars. Lawyer fees stacked like bricks, and every court date drained me. But I told myself, it's still cheaper than letting fear infect our home. One night, Ethan asked why I always looked tired. I forced a smile and said, "Because I'm carrying our shield." He nodded like he understood more than a 9-year-old should. So I filed another application. Not because I enjoyed the fight, but because my family deserved sleep without shadows at the window. Alyssa had learned the system well. She never violated the restraining order while it was active. She waited until it expired, then appeared again, on the sidewalk, at the school gates. The first 2 times she broke it, the court punished her. After that, she adapted. This time, I chose to adapt too. Instead of waiting for the cycle to repeat, Lauren and I prepared everything ahead of time. Documents, dates, sworn statements. For once, we were 1 step ahead. We suspected Alyssa had befriended a parent at Ethan's school to learn our schedule. My first instinct was to confront, to demand answers. But the lawyer's voice echoed in my head. Don't self-investigate. It creates 2-way communication. So I swallowed my anger. I chose patience, procedure, and silence over reaction. That night, Lauren wrote in her log, and Ethan sat between us, reading his comic books. For a moment, I realized the 3 of us weren't just surviving. We were practicing endurance. Sometimes victory looks like stillness. I thought about Maya often. She had grown up in an unverified story, carrying questions she never asked for. I wanted to reach out to say, when you turn 18, if you want, I will take the test with you. So I did. I sent a single text with that promise. But when no reply came, I understood. The door had closed again. Hope would wait for years. That night, Ethan sat on the porch with me. He handed me a baseball and asked, "Throw?" I looked at him and realized, even if hope had to wait, life couldn't. And so, I kept throwing. The message from my attorney came early on a Monday morning. Preliminary hearing for the new RO this week. My stomach tightened, because even though I'd been through this process more times than I could count, it never got easier. Each hearing meant standing in front of strangers, reliving the same cycle, and hoping the court would see the danger clearly enough to act. This time, though, my lawyer sounded more confident. He explained that the evidence from the zoo incident, the teacher's testimony, the written reports, the timeline we'd kept so carefully, gave us a high probability of securing a temporary restraining order right away. That TRO would hold until the main hearing date, where the judge could extend it longer. It wasn't permanent safety, but it was something, and something was always better than nothing. And then came the news I hadn't dared to hope for. CPS had officially confirmed they were reviewing Alyssa's case. They weren't just glancing at the file, they were actively investigating. For the first time in years, it felt like the tide might actually turn. Not just another cycle of paperwork, but a real chance at breaking free. In the days leading up to the hearing, I threw myself into preparation. I gathered every piece of evidence I had, the teacher's written report from the zoo, the photos of Alyssa hovering nearby, the timeline of past incidents that stretched back years. Each entry felt like a wound reopened, but I forced myself to put it on paper. If I wanted protection for Ethan, I couldn't afford to flinch. Lauren, as always, brought structure to the chaos. She organized everything into a thick binder, neat as a soldier's kit. Each page was labeled with dates, times, and short summaries so the judge could flip through and see the pattern at a glance. What looked like scattered harassment when told as anecdotes suddenly became undeniable when lined up in black and white. 14 years of repetition, documented, stamped, undeniable. When we finally stepped into that courtroom, it was clear the binder wasn't just paperwork, it was our strongest weapon. Judges don't respond to emotion alone. They respond to order, to facts, to details that can't be dismissed. And this time, we had all of it. The court liked order and details, and we had both. That night, before the hearing, my nerves betrayed me. I sat in the living room, every creak in the house amplified, every rustle outside making my pulse quicken. At one point, I heard the sound of leaves brushing across the porch, and my body stiffened as if it were a knock on the door. Old habits, 15 years of waiting for the next shadow, don't fade easily. Lauren noticed right away. She put her hand over mine, her voice steady, grounding me. "You're home. You're safe. She's not here." The way she said it wasn't just comfort, it was conviction. And for a moment, I let myself believe her, breathing slowly until the walls stopped closing in. But sleep never came easy that night. I lay awake, rehearsing what I would say, replaying every possible question from the judge, reminding myself to stay calm, factual, steady. No anger, no bitterness, just the truth laid bare. Because tomorrow morning, I would stand before the court once again, not just for myself, but for Ethan. Tomorrow morning, I would speak, and the judge would decide. I've asked myself the same question for years. Why not just take the test? One simple swab could end this entire war in a heartbeat. A DNA test doesn't lie. It doesn't bend to stories, doesn't care about reputations, doesn't flinch under gossip. It tells the truth, clean and final. If Alyssa truly believed her story, she would have welcomed it. If I were Maya's father, I would have embraced that truth the second she was born. That's the part that eats at me most. I'm not afraid of being a father, never have been. When Ethan came into this world, I stepped up without hesitation. I've been present for every scraped knee, every school project, every late-night nightmare. Fatherhood doesn't scare me. What scares me is the alternative, raising a child under a lie that poisons every relationship, every memory, every bond. That's why I've never backed down from the demand. One test solves everything. Yet here we are, 15 years later, because the truth has always been the one thing Alyssa refuses to face. And that's what I fear most, the lie that continues. It was only a matter of time before Ethan started asking the questions I had dreaded for years. One evening, as we sat at the kitchen table finishing homework, he looked up at me with those wide, searching eyes and asked, "Dad, why do people keep saying I have a sister?" The words hit like a punch to the chest. How do you explain to a 9-year-old that lies can travel faster than truth? I set my pen down and met his gaze. I told him calmly, "You have a family right here. Me, your mom, and you. That's the truth that matters. Someday, when you're older, you'll understand more about the stories people tell. But until then, what you need to know is that we're safe and we're together." He nodded slowly, but I could see the confusion in his face. He wanted to believe me, and yet the whispers from classmates and strangers had already planted seeds. That moment made it clear. My job wasn't just to keep Ethan physically safe from unwanted contact. I had to protect his mind too, shield him from the weight of a narrative that wasn't his to carry. One evening I walked into the kitchen and found Lauren leaning on the counter, tears streaking down her face. I pulled her close immediately. She wasn't weak, just worn down by the constant injustice, the cycle that never seemed to break. When she lifted her head, her voice was low but steady. "I'm tired, but I'm not broken. We finished this fight." Those words lit something inside me. Lauren wasn't just my comfort, she was my ally. Later that night, she took the phone and called the lawyer herself, documenting dates and follow-ups, while I updated the timeline. We weren't just partners in marriage, we were soldiers in the same war. That night, we locked the doors, not only the ones with keys, but the invisible ones inside our hearts. Nothing would get through unless it was truth. I've learned something over these years. Kindness doesn't mean erasing boundaries. Loving Maya from a distance doesn't mean opening the door to chaos. Lauren reminded me, compassion doesn't require surrender. And she was right. I could pray for Maya, wish her safety, but still protect Ethan from the storm. The morning of court arrived. I ironed my shirt, checked the binder, and kissed Ethan on the forehead before school. He looked at me and said, "You're my hero, Dad." I carried those words with me into the courtroom. They were my armor. Walking into the courtroom, I expected tension, raised voices, maybe even a scene from Alyssa, but instead the air was still, almost sterile. No one was yelling, no theatrics, just the shuffle of papers, the hum of the air conditioner, and the judge's even, measured voice guiding the room. When it was my turn, I stood, my binder in hand, and gave a short narration. No anger, no bitterness, just facts. Dates, times, reports. I explained what happened at the zoo, what had happened countless times before, how each incident was a repeat of the same dangerous cycle. I emphasized Ethan's safety, how the interaction rattled him, and how I feared the confusion it planted in his young mind. The judge nodded along, occasionally asking for clarification, flipping through the neatly organized exhibits Lauren had prepared. My lawyer leaned over at one point and whispered, "This is going well, very well." By the time I stepped back from the stand, I could feel the shift. The evidence was clear, the pattern undeniable. A temporary restraining order was not just likely, it was almost certain. And for the first time in a long time, I felt the faintest spark of relief. When the judge concluded the session, my lawyer leaned toward me and gave a subtle nod, his fingers making a small circle, our signal for okay. I let out a long breath I hadn't realized I was holding. The temporary restraining order was essentially granted, but I didn't celebrate. I couldn't. I'd learned too well that every small win was just a step on an endless staircase, and the next climb was always right around the corner. The next step, my lawyer reminded me as we walked out of the courtroom, was the long-term hearing. That's where the real test would come, when Alyssa would likely show up, maybe armed with her own story, maybe with nothing but her stubbornness, but always determined to drag the cycle forward. Before I could even dwell on it, my phone buzzed with an email notification. CPS had scheduled a meeting. They wanted to speak with me, with Lauren, and, possibly, with Ethan, depending on the circumstances. It wasn't a guarantee of resolution, but it was movement. For the first time in years, the system itself was beginning to look closer at the story, and that meant we had a chance. The CPS meeting wasn't in a courtroom or a lawyer's office. It was a small, plain room with 2 chairs on each side of the table. A notepad sat in front of the caseworker, and her eyes were steady, professional. She asked me to begin, and I knew right then this wasn't the time for anger or for smearing Alyssa. It was the time for clarity. So I spoke directly. I explained the pattern, the years of repeated harassment, the cycle of showing up after every restraining order expired, the incident at the zoo where Ethan was approached. I emphasized my focus, my son's safety, his right to grow up without confusion or fear, and the importance of respecting boundaries. I explained how the school staff had to intervene, how teachers and parents were now aware, and how that ripple could harm not just Ethan, but Maya as well. The caseworker asked questions, writing steadily, her pen never pausing. When I mentioned the possibility of a guardian ad litem, someone who could represent Maya's best interests independently, she looked up and nodded. Then she wrote it down. It was the first time I felt the system might be taking the idea seriously. I've learned not to let hope run wild. 15 years of circles, false starts, and closed doors taught me to be humble before fate. Anytime I let myself believe an ending was close, it slipped away. So even as I walked out of that CPS meeting with a flicker of relief, I kept my emotions in check. I reminded myself, this isn't over, not even close. Still, I couldn't deny the truth. The process was finally moving in the right direction. For once, it wasn't just me shouting into the void. There were teachers, a school, a lawyer, and now CPS, all weaving together the same story. This wasn't about petty arguments or resentment. It was about protecting children from being weaponized. That shift mattered. It gave me something I hadn't had in years: traction. That night, after Ethan went to bed, I sat at my desk, opened a blank document, and began to write. Not for the court, not for the lawyer, for Maya. A letter she might never see, or maybe one she'd read when she turned 18. I told her the truth, that I never ran, that I always left the door open for proof, and that my silence was not abandonment, it was survival. Then I saved it, tucked it away, and closed the laptop. One day, she would know. I kept writing, line after line, until the words felt steady. Maya, if you want to know, I will tell you everything. That was the heart of it. No theatrics, no anger, no bitterness, just the truth laid bare, the truth she had the right to hear. I made sure not to place blame in the letter. It wasn't her fault, and I refused to let her carry the weight of choices she never made. Instead, I wrote plainly, how I had always been willing to step forward if a DNA test confirmed she was mine. How I never turned away from responsibility, only from lies. I explained the conditions clearly. The test first, then support, then custody, then involvement. That sequence had never changed, and I wanted her to know it wasn't cruelty. It was the only way to keep everyone safe. When the words were finished, I printed the letter, folded it carefully, and slipped it into an envelope. I locked it away in my desk drawer, the key tucked into a place only I knew. That letter wasn't for today or tomorrow. It was for the right day, when she asked, when she was ready, when the truth could finally stand unchallenged. Until then, it would wait. There are always voices in the world that whisper, karma. They don't see the long nights in empty hotels, the endless flights, the marriage that had already fractured before pregnancy was ever mentioned. They see a headline, not a life. But I don't need pity. I don't need people to shake their heads and guess at my story. What I need is justice, clear, undeniable, written in science, not gossip. A diaper bag in a car, a motel receipt, on paper, those small things can twist into narratives. I've learned how quickly boundaries blur when emotion drives the story. That's why I've chosen process. Legal steps, documented logs, consistent action. It isn't glamorous, it isn't quick, but it protects everyone, Ethan, Lauren, and even Maya. People say I make it harder than it needs to be, but they don't understand. The easy way often becomes the wrong way. What is a real man? Some think it's someone who endures everything silently. I don't believe that. A real man doesn't let lies dictate his life. He takes responsibility properly, not under manipulation, but under truth. If Maya is mine, I will embrace her with everything I have. If she isn't, then she deserves to be freed from this story as much as I do. DNA is not a threat, it's a door, and someone has to be the one brave enough to open it. That someone is me. The words from my attorney still echo in my head. If there is a gal, we will recommend DNA for the child's benefit. It was the first time in years that someone outside my family circle said those words with authority, like it wasn't just a wish but a viable path. A guardian ad litem doesn't care about my reputation or Alyssa's pride, they care about Maya's best interests. And the truth, in this case, is absolutely part of her best interests. We began drafting a plan that went beyond just the test. Medical records, access history, and documentation of psychological risks, all organized, all prepared. Every time Maya was sent to approach Ethan, every time Alyssa forced her to carry the weight of a story she couldn't possibly understand, it wasn't just harassment against me, it was emotional harm against a child, and that mattered in court. For the first time in what felt like forever, I saw the jagged, looping mess of my life start to resemble something else. The endless circles weren't so endless anymore. I could see the line slowly becoming a straight line, a path forward, even if it was still fragile. 15 years. It's staggering when I say it out loud. 15 years is not just a number, it's an entire young person's life. Maya is no longer a baby in Alyssa's arms, or a child with pigtails tugging at her mother's sleeve. She's a teenager now, with her own questions, her own suspicions, maybe even her own quiet doubts about the story she's been told all her life. That realization cuts me deeper than I expected. Do I regret? Yes, but not my decision. I regret that Maya has lived under a cloud of uncertainty, that she's been used as a pawn in someone else's battle. I regret that I couldn't shield her from being dragged into a narrative that wasn't hers to carry. But I don't regret drawing the line. Without that boundary, I wouldn't have protected Ethan, Lauren, or even myself. And still, one truth stands unshaken in my heart. The truth that comes late is still the truth. A delayed answer doesn't erase reality. When that DNA test finally happens, whether tomorrow or years from now, it will shine the same light, and it will set both of us free. I've had to repeat this phrase so many times over the years, mostly to myself, but now to Ethan. It's not my fault that adults don't agree. I can't control Alyssa's stubbornness or the twisted story she keeps telling. What I can control is how I show up for my son, how I teach him to separate truth from noise, how I give him the stability Alyssa has denied Maya. One night, after the zoo incident, I sat on the edge of Ethan's bed and told him exactly that. He looked at me with those wide, clear eyes only a child can have, and he simply nodded. Then he said, "I trust you, Dad." 4 words, but they carried more weight than any court order or lawyer's argument. They reminded me what all of this was really about: protecting the life we've built, the peace we've fought to preserve. So I leaned closer, held his small hand in mine, and promised, "Dad won't let anyone cross our family's boundaries." It wasn't just a vow, it was the line I would defend, no matter how many years it took. There are nights when the weight of it all presses down so heavily that even I begin to doubt myself. One of those nights, lying awake beside Lauren, I whispered the question I'd carried for years. If everything were different tomorrow, would you still choose me? What I meant was, if the court forced a test, if Maya turned out to be mine, if our lives were suddenly rewritten, would she still stand by me? Lauren didn't hesitate. She turned to me, her hand resting firmly on my chest, and said, "I don't choose silence. I choose the truth." Her voice was steady, clear, and in that moment I realized she wasn't just standing beside me. She was walking the same storm with me. She had chosen this fight, not because it was easy, but because it was right. Hearing that gave me something I hadn't felt in years: courage. Not the shaky courage of survival, but the kind that lets you face the unknown head on. For the first time, I believed I could carry this story all the way through to its end. I've come to understand something over these 15 long years. Many people are afraid of testing not because of the result, but because of their pride. They fear what the truth might reveal about them, about their choices, about the fragile image they hold on to. But I am not one of them. Pride never mattered to me as much as clarity. I don't need to be right. I need to be honest. If a DNA test proved Maya was mine, I would take every responsibility that followed. Financial support, custody arrangements, college funds. I've rehearsed it all in my mind 100 times. And if the test proved she wasn't mine, then at least the chains would break, and the lies would finally lose their teeth. Either way, I'm willing to pay the price for the truth, even if it cuts me open. Now, with Lauren's hand steady in mine and Ethan's trust anchoring me, I feel the weight of the calendar. The hearing day is near. The papers are stacked, the binder ready, and my voice sharpened to say what needs to be said. On the dining room table sits the binder, our shield, and our sword. Lauren and I spent nights preparing it, color-coded tabs marking each section, police reports, restraining order renewals, teacher testimonies, CPS correspondence. Every page carries a date, a signature, a stamp. Post-it notes jut out like battle flags, each scribbled with reminders in neat handwriting. Emphasize timeline. Child safety first. Avoid speculation. I rehearse my words the way a soldier practices his drill. 90 seconds, no more. Concise, clear, stripped of emotion. Not because I don't feel, but because courts don't care about how tired I am or how many nights I've lain awake listening for phantom knocks. They care about facts, so I practice. My son was approached. There is a pattern. We seek protection. Over and over, until it sounds like steel. Lauren watches me, sometimes adding a suggestion, sometimes just nodding. The binder waits in its place, as if it knows tomorrow it will be lifted into battle. Everything is ready for the trial, and this time, I feel ready too. I don't waste time trying to predict what Alyssa will say. For 15 years, she's spun 1,000 different stories, and none of them ever matched. To speculate now would be like trying to catch smoke in my bare hands. I've learned to let her words pass over me, like static on a broken radio. What I hold on to instead are the facts. My two constant demands. 1, a DNA test. 2, if Maya is proven to be my daughter, then custody and support will be arranged legally through the court, with no room for manipulation. That has been my anchor through every storm. No matter how Alyssa twisted the narrative, no matter how many times she called me a deadbeat or poisoned the ears of others, I've never wavered from those two conditions. Now, as I sit in the courtroom, the binder resting like a weight on my lap, I focus on my breathing. Lauren squeezes my hand once, firm and steady. The door at the side opens and a hush falls over the room. The judge enters. When it's my turn to speak, I rise with the binder in hand. My voice doesn't tremble. I've practiced too many nights to let nerves undo me now. I begin with the zoo incident, describing how Maya approached Ethan, how my son did exactly what we taught him to do. Find a teacher, stay safe, and report. I hand over the school's written account, the photographs, the notes. The judge takes them without expression, but I can see the weight they carry in the room. Then I move through the history of the restraining orders. Each one, 2 years long. Each one renewed the moment it expired. 14 years of paperwork stacked like bricks, proof of persistence, proof of harassment. Finally, I outline my unchanging position. I have 2 goals, child safety and family peace. And the only bridge to both is the truth. That truth requires a DNA test. I am not running, I am standing here, ready for whatever it reveals. The judge leans back, thoughtful, and then turns toward the guardian ad litem. The air grows heavy. "What do you recommend for the child?" the judge asks. The hearing ended with no promises, but I caught small nods from the judge. The temporary restraining order seemed strongly noted. For once, I walked out of the courthouse without the weight of defeat. Lauren squeezed my hand as we stepped outside. The air felt lighter. Hope didn't feel reckless anymore. It felt possible. We received the next hearing date, another piece of paper to pin on the fridge. The lawyer told me, "Just keep at it." Simple words, but they've carried me this far. That night, Ethan slid into the chair beside me. "Dad," he asked, "if Maya really is my sister, does that mean you'll have to split in 2? I turned to him, heart pounding. "No, son. I will always be one thing first, your father. Nothing changes that." He looked down at his sketch pad and drew 2 stick figures, one tall, one small, holding hands. "Then I only need one dad. You." I stayed calm in court because I had no choice, but in that moment, I stayed calm because my son was watching, and I couldn't let him down. The way I see it, the DNA test leads to light either way. If negative, I'm freed from a false story that has haunted me for years. If positive, then I have another child, and I will carry that responsibility fully for the rest of my life. Both directions hurt. Both directions heal. But either way, they lead to clarity. And clarity is light. Justice doesn't always look like a celebration. Sometimes it's just a warrant stamped, a seal pressed onto paper, a door quietly closing. It doesn't fill you with joy. It gives you calm. And calm is all I've ever asked for. Tomorrow we continue. That night, I settle into something simple, something normal. I sit on the edge of Ethan's bed with a book in my hand. His eyes grow heavy as I read, his small smile fading into the rhythm of sleep. Beside us, Lauren moves quietly through the house, the scent of mint tea drifting from the kitchen. For the first time in weeks, the air feels soft. No tension in my shoulders, no weight pressing down. In that moment, I remember what it means to live, not just to exist. To feel safe enough to notice the ordinary, the creak of floorboards, the warmth of a blanket, the peace of a family gathered under one roof. It hits me that survival has been my default for too long, and nights like this remind me why I keep fighting. Then the phone buzzes. The screen lights up. A text from my lawyer. Only 2 words. Good news. My heart leaps into my throat. Whatever it is, it's movement forward. For the first time in years, I let myself lean into hope. The text from my lawyer wasn't vague. It was precise. CPS had officially forwarded the guardian ad litem recommendation to the judge. That single step carried more weight than a dozen restraining orders. It meant the system wasn't just reacting to harassment anymore. It was actively considering the child's best interest. An important step, one I had been waiting on for over a decade. If the judge approves the recommendation, my lawyer explained, we'll push for DNA through the Gale. That way it isn't about you or Alyssa. It's about Maya's right to know the truth. For the first time, the responsibility shifted from me carrying proof in binders and testimony to an officer of the court whose sole role was to protect the child. I sat back in the chair, phone still in my hand, and closed my eyes. For years, every ending I imagined was a door slammed shut, another cycle starting again. But now, for the first time in years, I believed in a different kind of ending. Not perfect, maybe not clean, but final. And that belief felt like oxygen. 15 years. That's how long this story has followed me. Through jobs, through marriage, through raising my son. 15 years of paperwork, courtrooms, shadows in the yard, and a child who may or may not be mine. And now, for the first time, the ending doesn't feel like a dream. The guardian ad litem recommendation is more than a legal step. It's the first real key that can unlock the truth. Here's the payoff. No matter how long the storm lasts, the truth has weight. Lies wear thin. Cycles break. And when the truth finally comes, it doesn't just free me, it frees Maya too. Because no child deserves to live under a question mark, or to carry the burden of another person's silence. I know now what matters most. To protect my family, to honor my promises, and to never stop choosing the truth, even when it hurts. If my story resonates with you, if you've ever faced lies or fought for clarity in the dark, share it. Leave a comment. And don't forget to subscribe, because stories like this are not just mine, they're ours. Together, we keep pushing toward the light.